today we will be discussing hedonic pricing method. As you understand that in case of reveal preference approach, we are having 4 different methods to evaluate the non-market goods and services. So, hedonic pricing method is obviously a reveal preference method, and here we are trying to understand. So, what exactly is this hedonic pricing method? What are the different uses and applications of this hedonic pricing methods, and how we are framing these hedonic price functions, and if you have to apply this hedonic pricing method, then what kind of or what are the different stages that we need to follow, and then we will be discussing what are the recent developments in this hedonic price method, and then finally we will be discussing what are the different problems that we are facing in the application of hedonic pricing method. So, let us start with the hedonic pricing method as it is. So, that is the meaning and definition of the hedonic pricing method. So, as you understand this hedonic pricing method, or popularly known as this SPM method, is a reveal preference method, and reveal preference method, they are based on the actual observations, right. So, that means here we want to find from our general observation, we are finding that the price of a large number of goods and services that we are found in the market. So, they are the function of a bundle of its attributes or characteristics. So, for example, if you have to say that price of a car. So, price of a car it depends upon the fuel efficiency, or you can say the safety information or safety standards that is there in the inbuilt safety standards that they followed in the particular car, or how reliable the car is. So, likewise you can explore your own examples that how the particular market good is a function of a set of or a bundle of its attributes or characteristics. So, when you are talking about the non-market goods like your the environment, then the same approach will be trying to explain the value of a particular commodity as a bundle of the attributes, its attributes, right. So, again I just want to highlight that. So, as this is falling under this revealed preference method, then this hedonic price method is only applicable to measure the use values of non-market goods and services. And again, as a basic feature of reveal preference method, this hedonic pricing method, it also uses not the actual market, but the surrogate market for finding the value of environmental quality or environmental goods and services. And if you try to see that what is the theoretical backgrounds of this hedonic pricing method, it has an established theory that is known as the theory of value. So, this theory of value you can follow from Lancaster, and even Rosen has expanded this theory of value, and have systematically modeled this hedonic pricing method based on the very theory of value. And so, this is what the broad theoretical framework. Although these two fellows, that is Lancaster in 1966 and Rosen in 1974, they systematically try to model this hedonic pricing method, but first of all it is Waugh in 1926, long back. He used this kind of hedonic modeling in the study of the price differences, basically fresh vegetables. So, again so far this hedonic pricing method is concerned in the environmental valuations. So, these two fellows, Redkard and Renning, they have applied it in case of this environmental valuations, and this hedonic pricing method, it tries to use different kind of techniques, basically the statistical techniques or econometric techniques, to estimate the implicit price marginal cost of each of these characteristics of a particular good or particular service, right. So, that is why we can actually find out what is the impact of a particular quality on the value itself. So, in this context you can say the application of these hedonic pricing methods, although nowadays we can say it is varied, but still it was applicable for a typical cases like your property prices or wage price determination, that is wage determination of labor. So, this hedonic pricing method it was used to estimate the economic value for the ecosystem or environmental services that directly affect the market prices. So, among these characteristics we can say it can be applicable to two broad markets that we can use this method to estimate the economic value of the particular environmental good or particular environmental characteristics. So, these are typically the property market and labor market, right. So, although we are saying that this initially this SPM method it was popularly applied to this property market in order to find these variations in housing prices, right. And this variations in housing prices actually reflect the value of different environmental characteristics, right. So, you are saying that these housing prices are functions of different local attributes of the environment where the particular house is situated, and that is why there we are having price differential of this of these houses. So, especially when you are talking about this property market, so this method is used to identify the value of non-market goods and services or goods or bads even that can affect the price of housing. And these non-market goods and services or goods and bads which can affect the housing prices, let us say it is the we can for housing prices or for demanding a particular house or to choose a particular house at a particular prices, we are taking into account so many attributes of this house, whether we are having frequent noise in terms of rail noise or your aircraft noise passing across or passing through, passing over or even nearby these noises, or what is the standard of air quality over there in that locations of your house, what is the kind of water quality we are finding, maybe the surface water for other purposes or groundwater for your own consumptions. So, that these are the variables we are taking into account, and these variables are likely to affect the housing prices. So, from this example of your property market, we can actually say that this is the basic premise of this hedonic pricing market that is related to the property market is based on the price of a market good is related to its characteristics, right. So, here we are talking about this property market, the property market that is housing market is related to the very characteristics of that particular house or particular location of this house. So, in a nutshell you can say that in this example we are trying to find these property prices as a function of different variables, let us say the property variables, right. So, what is the structure of the variable, what is the location of the variable, or you can say the neighborhood variables, whether it is safe, it is a relatively safer area or it is a remote area or it is a crowded area, or so far the accessibility is concerned that I actually value a particular property where the distance from this property to a good school should be there. So, that is why I will be valuing this particular property. So, accessibility to different needs like your infrastructures like your schools or hospitals we are also taking into account and that is also reflected in the property prices. We are also taking into consideration the variables like the environmental variables, right, like the quality of air, quality of water, or we are saying the other different amenity variables that is related to environment of that particular property we are also taking into account. And all these factors, all these variables are actually responsible in increasing or decreasing this property prices. So, that is how we can say that price of a marketed good is related to its characteristics or the attributes. So, in this case the hedonic price approach, it will be trying to identify how much a property differential, how much the price differential, right, is due to a particular environmental difference between the properties. So, if you are saying that you are actually the option of let us say 3 different, let us take 3 types of houses in a particular locality. So, this is x1, x2 and x3 building options. So, among these building options you can purchase one, and these are located in the in a particular area. So, very related area or in a particular surrounding even you can say. But however, the prices of all these 3 buildings are different. So, in this case you just try to identify what are these different factors because of which we are finding differences in prices. So, suppose say it is 8 lakhs rupees and it is 8.4 lakhs and it is 8.9 lakhs. So, why this price differential is there and what are the factors that can predict for these differences in this value of the property. So, that is how the hedonic pricing approach it tries to identify. And again this hedonic pricing approach it also tries to find out that how much people are willing to pay for an improvement in the environmental quality. Let us say the air the quality of the air got improved, right, in a particular locality, and because of which this improvement, how the people will be willing to pay for this improvement, right. And because of these improvements, because all the individuals they are willing to pay, and finally the air quality in that particular location got improved, they have done some treatment, some mechanisms, then we need to find out what is the social value of this improvement. So, this hedonic pricing method helps us in 2 directions. First of all, it is helpful in identifying those factors which are responsible for differential in property prices, and the second, it also identifies how much people are willing to pay for an improvement in the environmental quality, right, and as a result what is the social value of this improvement, we need to measure that. So, that is what the hedonic price approach it is helpful in finding out. And in case of the second example, that is the case of the labor market, and as you know that this in this labor market also hedonic pricing method is also popularly used, basically in order to find out, in order to find the wage differences. So, here this method is used to estimate the value of avoiding the risk of injury, risk of sickness, risk of death, by looking to the price differentials of the jobs or between the wages in the jobs with different exposure to the risk. So, here we are trying to find 2 things. One is the risk that is likely for a particular job, and because of this differences in risk, so what is the differences in the wage rates, right. So, in labor market also we are trying to find the value of avoiding the risk, how the workers they are valuing to avoid the risk of suffering from any injury or suffering from any sickness or death, and it also talks about the risk with respect to the different wages, right. So, whether this risk is reflected in the wages or not, that is also taken into account. And basically, so in this process the hedonic pricing it actually tries to collect so many examples, so many data on the prices and the characteristics of properties in a particular area. So, when you are talking about this labor market, the application of hedonic pricing in labor market, or you can say the application of this hedonic pricing in the property market, then obviously this hedonic pricing process, in order to carry out this process we need to collect different variety of the data. So, collection and compilation of data on different prices and the characteristics of properties are very essential in the hedonic pricing process. And moreover, the second thing that we need to consider, that what kind of statistical techniques we can use to estimate the hedonic price functions, or that is related to different characteristics of the particular property or particular house. So, these are the two essential elements or compositions prerequisite for the hedonic price method to process. So, in this context we can say that assuming the equilibrium in the market, so for the prices of the property price is concerned, then you can say in this equilibrium condition the hedonic price function of the property can be explained in terms of this function, that is the property price function is a function of your space, this structural characteristics, that is S, then neighborhood characteristics, that is N, and Q, that is the environmental amenities. So, we are trying to build the hedonic price functions, right. So, here you are trying to say that this property price is dependent on some parameters or variables. So, which are these variables? So, these variables are structural characteristics variables. So, when you are saying these variables under the structural characteristics, it may be like what is the size of the houses, how many bedrooms are there, so how many washrooms are there. So, this is related to structure, and these are different variables under this structure. So, that means you can say that we are taking a vector of these structural variables, we are preparing this variables in terms of a vector that explains this structure. So, likewise we can take the vector for the neighborhood characteristics, that which kind of locality it is, whether it is whether middle class people are residing over there, or these are the slum areas people, or they are educated enough people. So, that should not be any kind of unsafe situations to happen in that particular area. So, these are the vectors of neighborhood characteristics that we are also taking apart from this environmental amenities. So, if you have to after preparing this environmental functions, so this is the hedonic price functions. So, after doing this exercise by identifying that which are the factors that can affect the pricing of this particular housing or property, then the second thing that we must actually understand, that we need to estimate the marginal implicit price of the particular characteristics, that whether you are interested in finding that what is the marginal implicit price of the environmental amenities. So, if you have to find it, then obviously you need to have this partial differentiation of these functions. So, here you can say you are interested in finding out the marginal implicit of this amenity, that is Q. So, what you have to do, you have to find the first order partial differential function of this price, right. So, with related to the environmental amenity, that is with respect to dq. So, you are finding, so after doing this differential, that the del of this functions, PS functions with respect to your q, right. Then you are finding the marginal implicit and doing the rest of these things, then you are finding this dy dq of these functions, then you are expanding these functions, right, this function. So, what you are doing here, you are finding the marginal implicit price of amenity q, and as you understand this environmental amenities, this is a vector, right. So, which environmental amenity you are talking about, whether it is related to the water quality, right, or whether it is related to the air quality, you can identify by differentiating with respect to these variables, right. So, this is how the hedonic pricing function can be carried out. So, what are the, if you have to actually use it somewhere in the applicable situation, so how what kind of stages or what are the different stages that are essential to be followed. So, first thing is that, as you understand, that hedonic price function is estimated, we have already done that, right, and then we need to calculate the implicit price corresponding to this environmental variable that you are interested in, whether you are interested in the quality of air or water or other environmental qualities that we need to see. And then finally, we need to find out based on this information you can find this demand curve for this particular variable, let us say environmental variable of air quality. We can estimate that how you are demanding the air quality in that particular area of location for your house. So, first thing is that we need to actually have for finding this hedonic price functions, we need to estimate this hedonic price function based on this vector of parameters. So, for the region we need to collect data. So, which kind of data are required? So, these data may be related to the data on the house sale price on that particular locations, and let us say we are having 100 plots over that locations, and each of these plots are actually in the market, right. So, we need to actually collect the housing sale prices of these 100 plots and what are their characteristics. So, we need to collect this data for finding the hedonic price function, so that we can estimate it. So, what is the second stage? As you understand that we need to find out the implicit price, we need to estimate this implicit price. So, in this example of our property price, so we can actually partially differentiate this property price with respect to the characteristics that is interested and that is of our interest. So, maybe the quality or maybe the other environmental parameters that we are interested and the way you are valuing it. So, we can actually do this by differentiating with respect to the these attributes corresponding to the property prices. And finally, we need to have this estimate demand curve for this variable of air quality or water quality. And although the literature says that these are optional, so it depends that whether you need to find this demand curve or not, because your majority of works are done when you are valued, when you have already valued these environmental qualities, let us say air quality or water quality, in terms of finding this implicit prices, right. So, this actually tells the whole story that how the non-market goods like your water quality or air quality is being valued and it is reflected in the pricing of the house. So, for finding this demand curve, obviously we need to take into account all this data set, right, and we are finding that how from based on this, let us say 100 sales price are there, based on this you can derive the demand. So, the estimation of this demand curve, it is an inverse demand curve for the environmental quality, and we can find by doing this exercise of regression, right, and we can also find out this regression. After doing this regression, we can calculate the values of this marginal cost against different kind of environmental variables and also the socioeconomic parameters, right. So, that means not only we can find the importance of environmental variable, we can also find out how the individuals based on different socioeconomic parameters they are valuing this environmental variable. So, if you are drawing this demand curve, this picture is getting clear or it will be clearer. So, that how a particular educated person, let us say so middle class people or from income level of this range, right. So, how this person is valuing this environmental or let us say air quality in that particular locality and how it is reflected in his property prices, purchase of this property prices, right. So, if some other consumer is there, right. So, his education level is not actually good but he is rich. So, how it is reflected, how his preference is reflected in the property prices. So, that we can also find out from this. So, this so if you want to explore this kind of real life examples or examples that is already existed in the literature, you can explore to this literature, Garrett and Wells or Bookshare. So, interestingly you can find that in case of this second article, that is by Bookshare in 1981, these are the co-authors. So, they found out that the improving the air quality from this status, that is very poor status, to relatively fair status, the consumers they are interested to pay $5,800 per year, right. So, this is how you can find out that how the consumers or families basically for home. So, how the families they are interested to increase the status of their air quality from the status of poor air quality to the fair kind of air quality. So, this is how the SP method is helpful in finding out what is the value of a particular environmental parameter for the consumers or for the individuals. So, in this context, we have some developments in the hedonic pricing modeling itself. So, earlier we were not using this geocoded data. Right now, this geocoded data is available after the improvement of geographical information sciences. So, nowadays the literature or the applications are based on this data, that is geocoded and spatially referenced data. And we are also using the spatial econometrics. So, earlier we are using the statistics, the different estimating techniques like your statistics or econometrics like your regression. Generally, we are using these kind of methods in finding this hedonic price modeling, but right now we are also using the spatial econometric methods. So, that is again the additions or improvements in the hedonic price modeling, and we are also finding some literature that is also related to the combination of stated preference as well as this revealed preference, that is hedonic price method. So, earlier we are only focusing on hedonic pricing method, that is purely based on the revealed preference method, and you know what is the pros and cons of hedonic pricing method, and that is why right now we are using this hedonic pricing method and also this stated preference method like your contingent valuation method or your choice modeling we can use and combined, and so that the efficiency can be increased in the applications. So, these are the recent developments in the hedonic price method. So, what are the different issues that we are facing in applying this hedonic pricing method? So, the first thing is that when we are deriving this hedonic price function, what we assume that there is a equilibrium in the pricing market, that is housing market prices. So, this is, and again whether the equilibrium is there or not in the housing market, you can question, you do not know even. And the second limitation of this hedonic price method is lack of perfect information. Households may not actually have perfect information on particular housings, right, and their prices, or even if it is related to the wage differences, then households or the workers may not be fully informed about the risks from different jobs and how this the risk is actually covered or is reflected in terms of increased wages. So, they may not know even, they do not know what kind of risk they will be facing in a particular job. So, therefore, this wage risk choices do not actually reflect in the very valuation of risk by those workers. And another limitation of this hedonic price method is the omitted variable bias. So, what is that? When we are talking about the hedonic price function, we said these are the a function of set of variables, maybe your structure, maybe the environment, maybe other things. But exactly what would be the different variables under each of the vectors is very difficult. So, there is very likely that we may omit some of these variable under each of these vectors. So, in that case it will be biased. So, estimation will be a biased one. So, it can also happen. And another thing is that this hedonic price modeling, it may suffer from the multicollinearity problem. And again I just want to remind that we are using different statistical method and econometric method in order to measure this hedonic price model, right. So, this while applying this hedonic price method, we may suffer from the multicollinearity. So, let us talk about what is multicollinearity when the variables under the consideration, they do have correlations, right. And here these are the independent variables. When the independent variables, they are having certain correlations and we are taking both these variables, then we are suffering from issues, econometric issues, which is known as the multicollinearity. For example, you can say we are talking about the property price is a function of, right, peaceful area, right. Then you are talking about good school, then you are talking about less crowded, then we are also talking about less noise, and we are also taking into account traffic, less traffic jam, congestion, right. So, now analyze for good school. Generally good schools are located in a peaceful area, in a less crowded area, in a less noise area, in a less traffic congestion area, but you are taking all these variables which are having its correlations, right. So, here we need to be very careful that what kind of variables we are taking into account in a single vector, whether they are very related or not. So, that is what there is a challenge, and this hedonic pricing model, it may be prone to the multicollinearity issue, and this is an econometric issue. And another limitations we can also have, that is the choice of functional form of SV functions, that how to find this hedonic price function, because it is not likely to have a linear function, it will be non-linear function. But again under this non-linearity, which kind of non-linearity, right. So, the literature says that we can talk about the logarithm functions, right, it is generally used, but exactly we need to be very careful about taking into account the functions especially. Another limitations can be the difference between the expected characteristic levels of those properties that we are taking that we are considering, and actual characteristics of the properties that we are considering. So, what may happen, that house sales may be a function of expected future environmental conditions, right, but this expected future environmental conditions, they are not reflected. So, that means it is not observed. So, while finding out this hedonic pricing function, you may not be able to take those observed conditions. So, in this case this estimation of your functions would be a biased one. So, what is expected future environmental conditions? That may be the property dealers, they know that some kind of policies are there, because of which after 2 years or after 1 year the very environmental attributes would be changed. So, that means the environmental attribute is going to be improved. But when collecting your data on these, because we need to collect so many data level for finding this hedonic price functions, but even you cannot actually observe this changed environmental variable, right. but actually the property dealers they do know, and the consumers they also know about this policy, that after 1 year this these are the likely environmental changes going to happen in this particular locality, and that is why they will be their choice is reflected in terms of increased property prices, but the variables will be lacking here, because these variables are the object variables. We may not get the object data for this. So, in this case it will be we can get a biased result, because which one is to be taken into account, which characteristics attributes, whether it is expected attributes that is proposed that will be happening after 2 years or 1 year, or what is the actual characteristic that is observed over here right now. So, another limitation would be attitudes to the risk, and some may be some consumers they are actually the risk taker and some are risk averter. So, in that case the hedonic price studies it may either overestimate the welfare changes, or it can also underestimate the welfare changes, right. So, that is all about the hedonic pricing functions, and how we need to be careful in implementing this hedonic pricing method, and what kind of data and what kind of stages we need to actually go through for finding this hedonic pricing functions. So, these are the basic suggested readings that you can follow. Thank you very much.